And they just take 10% of the haul, and whichever one of their hackers does the ransomware attack gets most of it. Isn't that wild?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild. Scalable business model.
It's a scalable business model. I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from Artnet News. It is the exhausted end of a jam-packed May, and we're staring into what promises to be a jam-packed June. I'm overwhelmed just thinking about it all, but excited to be talking about some of the big stories of the last few weeks for our monthly roundup with a few of my colleagues. Specifically, we are going to talk today about the big spring auctions with a focus on the biggest story of the week, or maybe the biggest story of recent auction times, really, the hack of Christie's website that spanned the all-important week of sales. Then we'll talk about a dispute between the artists Maurizio Cattelan and Anthony James over who owns the right to a specific art idea, which is shooting a gun at a metal panel and showing it as a painting. And finally, we'll talk about the public, I'm going to call it outrage over recent portraits of British royals, specifically King Charles and Kate Middleton. With me to navigate all this fuss and muss is Kate Brown, our senior editor who's in Berlin. Kate, how are you?
Hi, Ben. Doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm okay. And I'm actually better than okay because I'm here with Margaret Carrigan, our news editor Europe, who is normally based in London, but is actually here in New York right now, sitting next to me, because you were on a panel at the Art Business Conference, Maggie. So you got to pop across the pond, and that's a great thing.
It is a great thing. It was a really fun excuse to come to New York, and it's been great to be here, especially because the weather's been cooperating.
Well, we're going to get into it about these stories, but as usual, let's just get the motors started by talking about any art we've seen. Kate, what's on in Berlin?
I was just recently at the Hamburger Bahnhof. Artist Mariana Simnett has a new show that just opened there. And true to her style, it is very gross and very awesome and unusual. It was actually commissioned by the European World Cup, which is coming to Germany next month. It's a 3-channel video work that is all about soccer, but not exactly in a capacity that you've ever seen it before. So yeah, that was interesting. What about you guys in New York? Did you go to any shows together?
Not really. Maggie, you were here and then in Buffalo, right?
Yeah, I've been hopping around. I hopped a 45-minute flight to Buffalo, New York on Friday afternoon to visit some friends, but we did end up making it to the Buffalo AKG Museum, which I had never been to. And obviously it's, got this whole new part to it. And it was very exciting. And I was really pleased to have like a tour from a local who remembers it in all of its different stages. And I thought the Stanley Whitney show was really interesting. I wouldn't say I'm like a huge Stanley Whitney fan, but it was good to see so many works in one place. They had all these like bespoke vitrines to showcase his sketchbooks, which I actually thought was the most interesting part because he would just like make these little sketches and like right underneath it, like radical green. And I was like, yeah, radical green. And then, so I think that was, a highlight for me, but also like there's some like nerdy aspects for me where there's this Albert Bierstadt landscape right on like the top landing when you walk in. It was actually given by Albert Bierstadt. And like, I'm a real like American landscape fan. And I was like, oh my God, the artist actually gave this to the museum. Small things really excite me. So
that's awesome. You're making good use of your time in America.
What about you, Ben?
Well, I have, actually for the purpose of this podcast, I went to Chelsea to see Maurizio Cattelan and a bunch of other stuff. But I have to say the thing that's entertaining me the most is there's this kind of vibe right now. I don't know what to call it. Like extreme pop-ups, deep pop-ups, hardcore pop-ups. I went to this show way out in Elmhurst, Queens that is in a pantyhose exporting warehouse, import-export warehouse. And it's called Means of Production. It's curated by this group called Lunch Hour. And it's just, 70 artists in this warehouse that's just displaying their art literally on top of boxes of pantyhose. And I thought it was just delightful. It was a delightful experience. Really felt you were discovering stuff around every corner.
That is niche. Did the work deal with pantyhose as subject matter?
Not really. Some of it blended into the environment. Some of it really stood out. There are like videos in little niches. And there are a couple works that I mean, I don't know if they actually are using the pantyhose from the show. Yeah, literally, my only critique of the show is that it's called Means of Production, which sounds serious, but I think if they'd called it the Pantyhose Show, everybody would be talking about it. It just really reminded me of the excitement of like Discovery, and I was thinking my friend, the artist Jason Isolini, was just telling me he had just done a show in a Cube Smart container, all these really interesting digital artists in a container that you had to sign in to get into. And I just think that there's an interesting vibe of people finding inventive places to show stuff.
I feel like there's some kind of intersection there with like the late stage gentrification of New York and also Berlin, like the deep pop-up era also being a product of like people not being able to get spaces anymore.
For sure. And that's probably also why it delights me so much, because it suddenly gives me this kind of experience of raw or alternative spaces that, everything's sweet greens now. So, well, although, the sweet green salad show, I'm not opposed to it. Make use of that space. So perhaps that's our cue to transition from gentrification of New York to the magical motion of money around the art world. This was a big week of sales, important barometer of what's going on in the art world. Maggie, you were editing a lot of those stories. What happened? What was the big story here?
Obviously, going into the sale week, the other week, the market was already nervy because it hasn't really been the strongest year so far for sales. Obviously, the hack that Christie's experienced really set everyone on edge. So I really feel like that dominated the stories. And actually, the sales were pretty middling across the board. And I feel like, if anything, it kind of overtook those in terms of import. And so we can kind of maybe almost just push those sales to the back of our mind and forget about them.
Well, for people who don't know, I mean, this is a big story. This is like a place where art news becomes news. Like, what happened? What was this hack?
This is still rapidly developing. So I want to say, like, even by the time that, we get this out on the airwaves, something else might have happened. But it's one of these things where it had kind of been a bit of smoke and mirrors for a little while. Christie's wouldn't confirm nor deny. They called it the technology security incident rather than the hack, which, may be important for legal reasons for them. Basically, their whole website was taken down just a couple of days before the auctions were due to begin. And obviously, that's not an ideal time. These are some of the, if not the biggest sale weeks of the year. And you have collectors looking at the catalog. You can bid online a lot of the time. I wouldn't say that necessarily the evening sales have as many online bids. There's, of course, plenty of online bidding, but those evening sales have lots of people in the room and lots of pre-organized guarantees to bedrock them. I'm curious to see kind of like really parse the data from the day sales to see if there was any impact, because obviously a lot of people don't show up in person for those, will bid online and whatnot.
It also affects journalists. I mean, I remember, I think it was like Friday before the sales started, I was editing your preview piece, actually. I was just cross-checking something and it said scheduled maintenance, right? That was the thing. And I was like, wow, this is really inopportune timing for quote unquote scheduled maintenance. And then, of course, as you just described, it turned out that it was a lot bigger of a problem than some small glitches in the system. We should talk about the new news, which just broke over Memorial Day weekend, right? Which is that it's become pretty clear now that it's actually ransomware and that there might be a huge data breach of like 500,000 clients' information circulating.
The website was down for 10 days, and Christie's is a pretty big company, and they weren't really saying what was going on. It was pretty opaque. And
how weird of them.
Yeah, how weird of them. But even in some of the coverage, or even just kind of knowing as little as I know about cybersecurity, it sounded like a ransomware attack, because why else would it be so difficult to get it back up?
Totally. I mean, I think that was the thing, is that like by the time we hit day 2 of this, most hacks, if they're small fry, you can resolve pretty quickly. It went through the whole week. Specialists at the auction house were having to send out individual links to collectors if they needed to bid online or see catalogs online. They had to set up like a whole side website to operate from. I mean, that's insane.
Yes, it's a wild thing to happen. It must be devastating. I mean, a lot of the reporting says that people inside the auction house didn't know what was going on and weren't getting explanations. I know Guillaume Cerruti, our colleague Eileen Kinsella, who was at the sales reporting on, would say that he was like very salty about how it was being covered. He's very, very sensitive. just directly saying to reporters, making sarcastic comments, because some of the New York Times coverage suggested that he was away from the auction house when this happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think to throw Christie's a bone, I mean, their sales went off relatively smoothly in spite of what was probably really chaotic behind doors. But just to go back to this, what's become apparently a ransomware attack, in the screenshot that was shared by at least one cybersecurity expert, the Ransom Hub, which is allegedly the people behind this, they said, quote, "We attempted to come to a reasonable resolution with Christie's, but they ceased communication midway through." So obviously there was some sort of negotiations that, like, according to one side, I don't think Christie's has publicly commented on this, but like have stalled or not moved forward. So it's just very strange. And then they go on to say like that Christie's will incur heavy fines from the General Data Protection Regulation, which is like the EU data body. This is such a bizarre story on so many fronts, but I was also remembering that in August last year, they had that data breach as well, right? So there was some foreshadowing to this. Do you guys remember that?
Yeah, vaguely. And I feel like it got brought up again. I think that was one that kind of got swept under the rug rather quickly. But of course, with this breaking, everyone's kind of like, well, it's been under attack before. And I think it's been targeted more than once.
Well, that earlier incident is fascinating in its own right, because I believe that was like a German cybersecurity firm announced basically in a kind of as white hat hackers that you could determine the location of collectors' houses based on metadata that was still contained in photos of the art, which is something I would not have thought of, and just shows how fast like issues are multiplying in this interconnected, digital Mr. Robot kind of world that we live in. I was reading up on Ransom Hub this morning. It's fascinating. It is only been around since February and has already done like more than a dozen major hacks, including of a United Healthcare website, and threatened to leak health data about, millions of people. And it's a really interesting outfit in the sense that, like, on their About page, they say they don't target anybody in countries of the former Eastern Bloc, anyone in China, anyone in Cuba, or anyone in North Korea, and they don't target nonprofits. It's a fascinating thing. And they specifically have this kind of like McDonald's franchise model. It's called ransomware as a service, where they just have a distributed network of hackers who can kind of like work with them, and they just take 10% of the haul, and whichever one of their hackers does the ransomware attack gets most of it. Isn't that wild?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild. Scalable business model.
It's a scalable business model, and seems to be, I think, this Christie's situation definitely makes them probably one of the most infamous outfits in the world for this kind of crime. Can I just say what I think is really funny? The cybersecurity expert who found this said that they had posted, to prove that they had the hack, names and birthdays of collectors on the web. And I just think it's really funny, the idea that the sensitive data would be like people's actual birthday. Like they were lying about their age or something like that. But I know there's a lot of really sensitive data.
There's a lot of big clients in that list, if they do release that, which I think they've been given, the deadline of the end of this month. So it's days away to see what happens.
There is a countdown clock right now on the dark web that will end at the end of this month, shortly after this podcast comes out. So we'll see by then what has happened.
I mean, this is a client base that is like highly, highly prizes their discretion. And as we all know from our line of business, like trying to find out who bought what is very, very difficult at the best of times. I think on that screenshot that was shared, they said like, we have birthday and much more. So maybe there'll be some previous purchases that will come out. I mean, who knows? Yeah. But how did the sales go like otherwise? Because there was the Bryce Martin that was like heavily marketed in advance of the sale that was withdrawn, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a big point, is that all three major auction houses in this round of sales actually pulled major works really down to the wire right before the sales started. So I just kind of think that really underscores the lack of demand out there right now. People really, are just kind of really keeping their cards close and their wallets closed. That was a big point for me. And then also, we really saw a lot more guarantees this season. I mean, in some cases, these sales were 2/3 to 3/4 already sold across the evening sales, meaning that, someone had already promised to pay X amount for these works, and they went directly to their guarantor. So just showing that there's a lot of hand-wringing in the background to make sure that this goes off, and looks like a very robust sale when it was a little like more. Can
I just ask you, and maybe this should be the last question before we move on, but yeah, There was that big Bryce Martin, which was multi-million dollar painting that was pulled at Christie's beforehand. And because of the hack, I mean, there was some question about whether that would affect people's sentiment or just people's sense of security going to this. So is it your assessment that it was more just general market jitters? And if it happened across all the houses, it seems like it wasn't the hack.
Yeah, I don't think that necessarily that the hack would have influenced something like the Bryce Martin, but I mean, it could have. I mean, if someone was already feeling nervy about putting that up for sale and then they were maybe like, this is maybe just not the right time for it or something like that. I think ultimately it is more of like a systemic problem more than just, incidental with this one. But I think ultimately the hack isn't going to help any of the auction houses at this point, because if people were already feeling on edge about selling work in this climate, they're not going to feel any better about it going forward. And I think this is going to be like a really long tail to this story, because a lot of auction houses have to do a real deep dive into how their systems work.
Yeah, I mean, just to close that off, I totally agree. I think Todd Levin said in an article that was published on Artnet, you have 2 world wars, a presidential election coming up that is freaking people out, and then a major auction house couldn't get its catalog up for 3 days. Like, this is a thing. Like, really, those things are just like a pile-on
And
of problems.
The weirdest thing about that is I think the last one is the most important of these people. I think these people who pay that kind of money for this stuff are so insulated from world events that really the thing that concerns them most is that their personal data might be exposed. Of all those world crises, that's my 2 cents. And on that note, speaking of, art market woes and disputes, let's turn to our second item, which is this, well, I don't know if it's funny. Let's talk about it. Dispute between 2 artists here in New York. Maurizio Cattelan, who's a very famous Italian artist who makes art that tends to go viral. I mean, he might be most known to our viewers for taping a banana to the wall of a gallery booth at Art Basel Miami Beach and making headlines that way. We have a previous podcast about that. But he came out of semi-retirement, opened a new group of works at Gagosian Gallery, which includes marble sculpture of a unhoused person sleeping on a bench, urinating on himself, and a series of gold panels that he has shot with a gun, so they look kind of pimply and pockmarked. And it just so happened that show up on the exact same day as another show by an artist named Anthony James, who has long done a very similar series of metal panels that he has shot with a gun to create a kind of pockmarked landscape that, I don't know, is supposed to make you think about violence and glamour and luxury and how they all collide. And there's been a very public war of words between these 2 artists. Basically, James coming out demanding to know whether there's any evidence that Cattelan had seen his work before, talking about how he's very famous for these works of art. They're very, very similar. Cattelan and his people shooting back. I think they even released a list of other works that involved people shooting at a canvas to prove that, no one has the sole rights to this idea. I did go to Chelsea to see this. What do you guys think about this? Stupid story or interesting story?
Well, it's 2-pronged, right? Like, I really want to pitch it back to you because I'm curious, like, before we talk about the sort of potential legal battle that's breaking out, like, is Maurizio Cattelan's big return and his, like, debut at Gagosian, is it a good show? That's something that has been kind of, like, overlooked. The show hasn't really been evaluated that much because everyone's just talking about this lawsuit. It seemed to me like he's, like, the funny guy, but this is, like, not that funny. And I'm a defender of humor in most places, but this one feels like it didn't quite land.
Yeah, it feels like kind of a sour joke. Our colleague Andrew Russeth actually wrote it up as a review, and I more or less just agree with him, so people should read that. Although I do find the sculpture a pretty sour joke. I don't know if it's just because the show in Chelsea is right around the corner by a show from Charles Ray, who's a great hyper-realist sculptor, and a few years ago, Charles Ray had a sculpture of an unhoused woman sleeping on a bench. It looked exactly like this piece. I mean, it lacks the element of the person urinating on themselves, which is, I guess, supposed to make this funny, but they really look strikingly similar. So it just shows you how ideas, it's easy to have the same one. I think Andrew said in his review about the panels, the less said about them, the better. Now they're the only thing people are talking about. They don't do a lot for me. I think the media about it says the Italian artist confronts gun violence in America. Viewers see their own reflections riddled with bullet holes in the seductive beauty of gold's glimmer. That seems pretty facile to me.
I was thinking about right before this show opened, and I have to say, full disclosure, I haven't seen the show yet. It's on my list for this afternoon, but the New York Times ran like a profile of Cattelan, and I remember this quote in it where he's like, even if people know the banana, nobody knows who I am as an artist. At the same time, I thought they did a great job of pointing out that, like, as he was saying this, essentially someone on the street recognized him and asked for this autograph. So it's like, there's almost like a disconnect. He's really trying to position himself with the show, I feel like, as being more serious in some ways, or trying to like take on this kind of mantle of being really like thought-provoking, provocateur, which he's always done in a lot of ways. But in this way, is like the surface level commentary on like American culture. It feels really gratuitous to me. And I'm curious to see it in person. But so far, I haven't really read a review that makes me feel like it's going to change my mind.
Yeah, as a commentary on America or something, it just feels very flat to me. Like I said, there's a Charles Ray sculpture of a similar subject matter that, yeah, I just did find at the time just somehow kind of dehumanizing, and just how, I don't know, it's just really like treating a person like really at a very vulnerable place as just an object to be looked at. You can read it all kinds of ways, but it rubbed me the wrong way. And then the Cattelan is even, in this case, I mean, it's just literally this person's penis is out in their hand, like dribbling water, which I can see why someone would think that is funny. I do not find it funny. I mean, I find it really cold, dehumanizing. And as a commentary on America, it just more seems a commentary on how distant people are, how people can't even see not a commentary, just I think it embodies how people can't even see the subject matter. I do not think, I think of Henry Moore's great, images of people sleeping in the tube in London as really humanist in the full positive sense. I mean, I don't think it's subject matter you can't treat, and I think people can treat it in all kinds of ways. But these in particular, I find pretty dark. But we've gotten away from, the thing everybody's talking about. Do you think anybody owns the right to riddling a metal panel with holes? What do you think about that claim? I mean, they look a lot alike.
They look a lot alike. I mean, God, it's not really up to me. I feel like it's a court that will make this call. And as far as like the precedence of trying to prove copyright infringement in art, it's very difficult. Like, it's not like an IP. However, the resemblance is absolutely uncanny. Like, even the fact that they're tiles of like a certain kind of ratio, and like sort of the way that it's installed is also so similar. It's not just the kind of like quote unquote action painting of like shooting at a metal wall. It's really the way it's installed too. I was looking around too to remind myself about these sort of previous court cases, and it's just often a losing battle, no? I'm curious what you guys think.
Well, I don't think there's actually a lawsuit filed yet. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's more just like a public request for clarification of how Cattelan made these works, whether he had previous exposure to the Anthony James work. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
I think there's just been a series of letters, nothing filed in a court.
What do you think?
I kind of agree. I think it's going to be a difficult one to litigate. The precedent for this kind of case is not a strong one for, I would say, James. But at the same time, like, I do think it's interesting just kind of like the back and forth right now, because I think that the court of public opinion will also really influence this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what struck me about it is that the same thing happened with the banana, right? I mean, there was an artist who came out and said, You took my banana idea. I'm the banana guy. And I was just thinking, maybe that's very telling. That Cattelan, I do have to say, he's very good at hitting the button that makes something go viral. I mean, and that is a talent that is a real talent in our particular information economy. And one of the ways you do that is you find something that kind of makes you say, that's art. And when you're working that close to life, you're working with de-skilled work or appropriated work or ideas that kind of seem like jokes, I mean, that's inherently going to take you into territory where other people are playing in that space, It's not like painting a really detailed mural or something where there's a lot of like intricacy and detailing that completely distinguishes it your own. Like, the whole idea is that it's like a thing that you look at and kind of get all at once as a meme, and memes inherently circulate.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in a very like algorithmically driven echo chamber of aesthetics. And if you're working in the zeitgeist like he is, it's like you're bound to have some uncanny resemblances with other people who are like tapping into that. I mean, I don't give him a pass. I think also, you bring up the banana and also the bullet hole work it's not exactly like the accusations that are made against artists like Richard Prince or Jeff Koons or something. They're really like appropriation artists. So somehow it's like folded into the concept. And I think that that's where this also gets kind of strange with Cattelan, where he would almost have a better argument if he was like, I'm just, seeing ephemera online and drawing it in, but he really like stands by the originality argument, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, seems to. I don't know why you would. It's not that great of an idea, to be honest, but I can see that if you were Anthony James and this was one of your signatures, it would feel like a lot of disrespect, because Anthony James himself, he's a widely circulated artist, and this happens all the time. I think a musical appropriation or something where it's less like someone saw something and literally copied it. It's more like just a hook was in their head, and that just sort of became an idea that looks a lot like or sounds a lot like something that was already out there.
Yeah, very bittersweet symphony. But also I was thinking like in the worst case that this does go to court, it's like the price difference of these works is also something worth talking about, right? Do you guys remember?
That's got to hurt you if you're making this kind of work and then someone does the exact same thing. And what is the price difference? Oh, yeah. It's $375,000 for the Cattelan, $40,000 each for the James, which, either way, it's a lot of bread for some like metal with holes in it. But a world where people's relative value is determined by price tags, it's kind of smart.
Yeah.
Moving on to other controversies that split the difference between stupid and sublime. Everybody wants to know what I think about these royal portraits. Kate, do you want to tell us what's going on?
Yeah, the royal family's having a weird time right now with imagery. It's like not been there a year. So there were two paintings that kind of were soft launched in the past couple of weeks. There was Jonathan Yao's portrait of King Charles. And then there was a portrait that the Tatler magazine commissioned of Kate Middleton, which we should discuss separately because they are quite different paintings somehow, despite being royal portraits. Yao's painting was an official portrait commissioned by the royal family. And it is, for those who haven't seen it, although I feel like that was probably very few people considering how viral it went and how many opinions were flying around. It's this reddish pink swirl of color. And Charles is kind of like, I don't know if he's emerging from it or receding into it. He's definitely like in the swirl. And then there's a little monarch over his shoulder, which apparently was a suggestion of the king's, to sort of denote the transformation from prince to king. We'll move on to Kate's painting after, but what did you guys think of this? Maggie, you live in London. What's the vibe?
I would say that it brought the country together by making fun of it. It was a rare moment of unification for the UK. I will say I think there were plenty of people that actually really liked it. I think that royal portraiture can be very, interpretive in this day and age, and it should be. It shouldn't just be photorealist image necessarily, but there was so many good takes on it, just about, the blood red nature of the portrait and how that speaks to a colonial legacy. But I think ultimately it made me wonder, if King Charles is happy with it, like, I guess that's who it's for ultimately. Like, but who are these portraits for?
Who is the royal family for?
What I think is sort of interesting about this pair of micro stories is that they really are kind of complementary in that the Charles portrait is an official royal portrait. Like, this will hang where the royal family can see it, where people will look at it. It's very big. The Tatler portrait, is a commission for the cover of a gossip magazine. It's interesting that in this day and age, those kind of like land on the same level in the media coverage. And I think they're both failures, frankly, but I think that they are failures in complementary ways. Whereas the Tatler portrait just doesn't look very much like Kate Middleton. What it's doing is very, very conventional. It's like, here's a glamorous likeness of this person, but it just doesn't look a lot like her. I actually put the face into a celebrity face identifier.
Who'd they find?
It did guess Kate Middleton, but she was like number 5 in the list. Its top guesses were Kristen Davis from Sex and the City, Jennifer Connelly, Jamie Lynn Spears and Sarah McLachlan were all higher percentages.
I concur with those assessments.
And then the King Charles painting, look, it's a swing and a miss, but it's a swing, and I appreciate that. It's trying to do something different. I mean, to me, it feels like reaching for the kind of sensation people got from the Barack Obama presidential portrait, where he was depicted in a very unconventional way, and that kind of worked. But the effect is really eerie.
I also think that the whole Kate Middleton portrait comes at an interesting time, given there was so much concern about what was a real image of her and what wasn't. Just a couple of months ago with like the AI concerns when she just wasn't appearing in public. And so, I mean, it's tangential, but it's also just like there is like a real discourse around what it means to like represent somebody right now in like a meaningful and like true way. And I just kind of thought she can't really catch a break. Every image of her that's circulating out there right now is not quite right.
And the conspiracy theorist in me wonders if you Google now Kate Middleton portrait, or in a few weeks once the story has like fully like baked into the public mindset, whether the photoshopped image that caused such a controversy a few months ago will show up, or this Tatler magazine thing. Like, in a way, it almost like buries that like scandalous image that had showed up in March that everyone was really quite upset about. So it's a weird thing. And on the note of like this kind of idea of like working with the like scandal generator that is the internet, I also feel like the Charles painting is almost a success story, because in the way that it generated so many opinions, like quote unquote, he's burning in hell, or he looks like he's in a womb, or whatever, like all these different user takes, it makes the royal family trend on Twitter.
My favorite thing about the Tatler painting is that in launching it, the magazine said that the artist had pored over some 180,000 photos of the princess, which is so ridiculous as a claim, because if she spent even 1 minute on each of 180,000 photos, it would be like months and months, maybe years of time. And there are like photos that are pretty directly referencing the exact outfit she's wearing in this painting. I should say there's also kind of an ugly kind of side of this controversy, in that the painter is, I should check, from Zambia, I think.
Zambia, British, yeah. Hannah Utsar is her name.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of really ugly online commentary that crosses the line from being about the painting to being about, this is like a woke commission, and that's why they've gotten a bad painting and stuff. That's pretty despicable.
I think some of that's coming out too. This is like it's not related to the royals necessarily, but this is all happening at the same time that there was the wealthiest woman in Australia too wanted her portrait taken down in one of Australia's museums. She just didn't like the way she was represented. It was by an Aboriginal artist, so there was lots of disparaging conversation around the quality of the art when it wasn't supposed to be a photorealistic representation of her, and she was basically, her vanity was affronted by just the style of the painting, and she, in an act of entitlement, asked to have it removed from this show of many portraits of many different people. So I think there is, like you said, the ugly underbelly that you have to be like really skeptical of in some of these conversations as well.
Yeah.
That's terrible. Yeah. And like on another note, the long tradition of like portraits of royal family members or wealthy people in general, it's in a weird moment right now where there's so many images of these wealthy people. So it's like much harder to please the public when, we all have seen so many pictures of these people. And I think that there is something to that. And actually, I was reading Jonathan Jones's very cheeky 1-star review of King Charles's portrait, and he recalled the Lucian Freud portrait of the Queen that was made in 2001, which, it's Lucian Freud. I mean, he's one of the most famous painters of all time. And at the time, people said that she looked like one of her corgis who had suffered a stroke. And this was like in 2001. I think that this is just part of maybe the portrait tradition too, that like these portraits get unveiled and then everybody hates it and then it just becomes part of the National Gallery anyway. I don't know.
People always say that you look like your pets anyway. So, I mean, that might have been bang on.
Well, I would give it 2 stars, 1 star is too low for me because I appreciate the swing. Whatever you make of it, whatever grisly nightmares it gives you, great conversation piece for the royal families. I say, good work from the Worshipful Company of Drapers, which is the official organization that commissioned it for them. At the very least, they've given us something to talk about. And I think we should leave it there. Maggie, so nice to have you in New York.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was great.
And Kate, always lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been revelatory. Thanks, guys.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, please take a moment to rate and review our show. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.